Good morning, Hassan Huskies. This is your principal, Dr. Miller. Today is Monday, December 18th, 2024. Please stand with me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, Hassan Huskies, we are looking for students who are showing empathy. Empathy is a building block of morality and a key ingredient of successful relationships in school and beyond. Clues can tell us a lot about how someone is feeling. Look at their faces. What do you notice? Look at their bodies. What do you notice? Think about what's happening. What do you notice? Hassan Huskies, each grade level is looking for 2 students who have gone up way above and beyond showing empathy in the month of December. All right, it is fun week at Hassan. Today is Ugly Sweater Day. Tomorrow is Mistletoe Socks. That means we're going to wear funky socks. Wednesday, we're feeling frosty, and we're going to wear white and gray. Thursday is Whoville Hair and Wear, which is a super fun day. And then Friday, the last day before break, we're going to be nice and warm and toasty and cozy in our PJs. All right, Hassan Huskies, we have a lot of birthdays. We have Olivia and Mrs. Dazowski, Jasmine and Mrs. Holloway, Liam and Mrs. Leach, Addison and Mrs. Dazowski, Jade and Mrs. Meeker, Graydon and Mrs. Dockendorf, Cooper and Mrs. Oakland, Theodore and Mrs. Edie, Dylan and Miss Hanlon, Aaron and Mr. Willenbring, Landon and Mrs. Spears, Xander and Mrs. Dazowski, Rory and Mrs. Spears, James and Mrs. Moline, Noella and Mrs. Moline, Croy and Mrs. Clems, Ethan and Miss Dockendorf, Riley and Miss Edie's, Evelyn and Mrs. Sylvester, Charles and Mrs. Lazars, and Jackson and Mrs. Lazars. Hassan Huskies, we also have half birthdays. All right, we have Cohen and Mrs. Petter, Chase and Mrs. Stimmick, Eli and Mrs. Clem, Avery and Miss Choi, Oliver and Mrs. Clem, Lucia and Mrs. Stimmick, Samuel and Mrs. Greenwald, Cody and Miss Holloway, Evan and Mr. Willenbring, Stella and Mr. Willenbring, Lucy and Mrs. Greenwald, Harper and Mrs. Stimmick, Jalen and Mrs. Harns, Calvin and Mrs. Oakland, Noah and Mrs. Oakland, Cassius and Mrs. Stimmick, Colton and Mrs. Leach, Adriana and Mrs. Dazowski, Rishwanth and Mrs. Reed, Blake and Mrs. Ashley, Mark and Mrs. Harns, Brecken and Mrs. Lazars, Miles and Mrs. Petter, Anthony and Mrs. Harns, Elizabeth and Mrs. Stimmick, Otto and Mrs. Greenwald, Finley and Mr. Ashley, Riley and Miss Choi, Gia and Mrs. Dazowski, Jade and Mr. Willenbring, and August and Mrs. Lazar's class. Happy birthday and happy half birthday. Teachers, a copy of the list is also in your mailbox. You should have received it on Friday. All right, Hassan Huskies, we know that it's a great day to be a Husky, and we are thinking about being kind friends, showing empathy. It's going to be a fun week, but a week we also have to really make sure that we slow down and make really great choices. Remember, you belong here. It's a great day to be a Husky.